This is the Hobbymate D6 Dual, and it has been my favorite LiPo charger pretty much since I reviewed it some time back. But it's not for everybody. It's pretty freaking big. And a reason that it's so big is because it has a built-in AC power supply. Not all chargers do. In fact, a lot of people who buy a charger take it home and they're like, how do I plug this thing into the wall? It doesn't plug into the wall. It plugs into your power supply. Oh, you didn't buy a power supply? Yeah, that's not included. Well, with the Hobbymate D6 Dual, it is included, but that means it is bigger and heavier than you might prefer. Enter the Hobbymate D6 Dual Lite. This is a similar charger, but it doesn't have a built-in power supply. And that means it's smaller and lighter and easier to take with you for those times when you're wanting to charge batteries in a place where you don't have a power supply. Yes, for example, I've got a plug wired up to the battery of my car, so I can plug this guy into the battery of my car. In fact, I made a video about installing that plug on my car battery, and I'll link it in the end screen at the end of this video if you want to check that out. But what do you do if you've got the D6 Dual Lite and you want to charge your batteries at home? Well, you could have a great big honking 2400 watt power supply like I built, but most people aren't going to do that, especially people who are just getting into the hobby. Enter this guy, the Hobbymate T240 Smart Power Supply. And this is a 240 watt power supply that is designed to go with the D6 Dual Lite. In fact, it even got freaking magnets to hold them together so they kind of just stay together on the bench, see? And this guy plugs into the back here and then plugs into the wall here, and now you got a pretty cool little setup. Run it off the 240 watt power supply when you're at home, take it and use it, put it in your backpack and travel with it, and use it in the car or wherever else at the field when you want to charge off a DC. Best of both worlds. Well, that's what we're going to talk about today. I'm Joshua Bardwell, and you're going to learn something today, is what I usually say after the intro to my videos, but I kind of feel like I've half reviewed this thing already. Nevertheless. In a few minutes, we're going to take a look at the interface of this charger and its features, but the first thing you got to do when you're considering buying a charger is decide whether it can output the amount of power that you need to charge the batteries that you want to charge. So here's how we do that. We start with the watt rating of the charger, and this charger is rated at 600 watts, but that is 600 watts divided between two output channels. It can charge two batteries at the same time, and each of those channels can do 300 watts. So the first thing you need to do is convert that 300 watts into amps. And you do that by dividing by your battery voltage. And of course, that's going to depend on what type of battery you're using. If we're using a 4-cell battery, 4 cells times 4.2 volts per cell, that is 16.8 volts. You probably already knew that. If we're using 6 cells, 6 times 4.2 volts per cell is 25.2 volts. Now I'm dividing by the fully charged battery voltage, and some people might find that a little controversial. You can get a different number by dividing by like the average cell voltage, because as the battery fills up, the charging is going to slow down. But I think that dividing by the fully charged cell voltage gives you the most conservative number, and so that's what I use. So let's assume that we're working with a 4S battery that is 300 watts divided by 16.8 volts. And that means that our nominal charging rate is going to be as much as 17 amps. Now that is the maximum that this charger can output based on its watt rating and its volts. But is it actually safe to charge at 17 amps? A rule of thumb when charging a battery is that you don't want to charge at more than a 1C charge rate. And 1C means that you take the size of the battery, so this is a 1500 milliamp hour battery. 1500 milliamp hours equals 1.5 amp hours. And that means that a 1C charge rate for a 1500 milliamp hour battery would be 1.5 amps. In other words, the takeaway is that this 300 amp per channel charger is more than capable of charging this 1500 milliamp hour battery as fast as would reasonably be safe. If you were to charge it any faster, you would be at risk of fire, and it wouldn't be a good idea. I said earlier that when you're thinking about battery charging, you want to think, how long does it take me to charge the battery? The rule of thumb is that at a 1C charge rate, it'll take about an hour to charge the battery. At a 2C charge rate, that's twice as fast, so it'll take half the time, about a half hour. At a 3C charge rate, that's 3 times as fast, so it'll take a third of the time, or about 20 minutes. At a 4C charge rate, it'll take about 15 minutes. At a 5C charge rate, it'll take 60 to 12 minutes. And you probably shouldn't be charging that fast, but you get the idea. There is another limitation here, and that is this 15 amp limitation. And that 15 amp limitation is per channel. That is correct. I just wanted to check that, which is a little confusing because this 600 watts is divided between the two channels, but this 15 amp is per channel, so it's not 7.5 amps per channel. Anyway, a little inconsistent there. We said that at 600 watts, you could charge a 4-cell battery at up to about 18 amps, but this 15 amp limit is going to kick in first. It's whichever limit you hit first. Well, that whole conversation might leave you wondering, what in the F is the point of having a 300 watt charger? Because any battery used by a typical mini quad pilot, it can charge it at 1 or even 2 or maybe even 3C or maybe even more if you are okay with the safety risks involved with charging even faster, which you probably shouldn't be, but that's a topic for another day. What's the point? It's like having a 1,500 horsepower car to take to the grocery store. You're just not going to use all that power. Parallel charging is the answer. If you use parallel charging, you plug multiple batteries into a parallel charge board and they combine together to act like one really big battery. So we could take 10 1,500 milliamp hour batteries, put them on a parallel charge board, and they would act like one 1,500 times 10 or 15 amp hour battery. At which point charging it at 15 amps would be a 1C charge rate, and that would be fine and perfectly safe. Parallel charging is a topic for another day, but the takeaway is that unless you're charging big parallel charging arrays, in which case you should work the math, or unless you're charging very big batteries, like 12 amp hours or larger, this charger is going to be more than enough power for anything that you might need to do. But there is a gotcha in all of this, and it relates to this power supply. You see, this power supply is rated for 240 watts, and that means that if you're using this T240 power supply, the fact that this charger is rated for 600 watts doesn't freaking matter, because the power supply can only give you 240 watts, and that's going to be the limiting factor. 240 watts divided by 16.8 volts for a 4-cell battery equals 14 amps. Remember that a 1C charge rate for this 1,500 milliamp hour battery was 1.5 amps. So it's fine. You get a total of 14 amps into a 4-cell battery with this charger. That's 7 amps per channel, and that's still probably more than you freaking need. It does raise the question, though, why? Why have a 600 watt charger paired with only a 240 watt power supply? And the answer is that a bigger power supply would be way freaking bigger and way freaking heavier and hotter, and you don't need it. So why derate the charger just because you're going to run it off a smaller power supply? If you're running this off your car battery or something and you can pull those amps, more power to you. But when running it off this, you're going to have less capacity. Still more than you need, though. Okay, fine. So this is more than most people are going to need. Then what has it actually freaking got? And to answer that question, I'm going to just plug it into this lipo, power it up, and we'll take a look at the menu. And if you're familiar with Hobbymate menus, it's going to look real freaking familiar. We've got 2 channels. We've got a channel change button that selects between the left and the right channel. I do like these gauges here when we're charging. That's pretty freaking cool. Showing channel 1 and 2, and then the split view, which shows the summary of both channels. We can pick a channel, and then we can click the jog wheel and select our charging tasks. It supports charge, discharge, external discharge. For external discharge, you would plug in like a load resistor to the output side, and you would dump the battery into the load resistor, you can discharge faster that way than if you're using the internal discharge of the charger itself. Storage charge and balance program. Balance program balances the cells at whatever current voltage they're at, as opposed to fully charging the pack and then balancing at the end of the charge. That confuses some people, because some people think that charge is to charge without balancing, and balance is to charge and then balance. Some chargers do work that way, but not this one. Charge, charges, then balances, because you should always balance at the end of a charge cycle. And then balance just balances at whatever voltage they're currently at. I'm not really sure why you would want to do that, but there you go. It also supports regenerative discharge, and this is pretty cool. In fact, this is the first thing I've seen that this guy doesn't have, that the D6 Dual Lite does have. Maybe they've updated the firmware on this guy to support this, but regenerative discharge is pretty cool because let me get the load resistor. This is a big old wire wound resistor. It's rated at about 2 ohms, and if you plug a battery into it, it will just discharge the battery down to nothing and kill it, converting all that energy into heat in sort of controlled manner. But you can also use this, it kills the battery if you do that. And that is in fact how I kill batteries when they're damaged or something. But if you plug this guy into the port of the charger, you can do external discharge, which I mentioned before, which will draw power from the battery here, dump it into this resistor as if it was a battery being charged, but it'll instead just turn into heat, and it will discharge the battery faster than the internal discharge mode of the charger. But a lot of people don't like that because you're just wasting that energy turning it into heat. Wouldn't it be nice if you could plug a battery in, and instead of wasting the energy discharging it as heat, you could just use it to charge up another battery? I've known people, not a lot of people, but I've known people who keep a great big lead acid car battery in their house, and they use it to charge all their lipos. And then when they get done flying and they come back and they've still got some lipos that they didn't fly, they'll dump that energy back into the lead acid battery using regenerative discharge. And that'll keep those batteries at a safe storage voltage so they maintain their best performance and not waste energy as heat. This is a really cool feature to see a charger support, and I'm pretty psyched to see that this has got it. Lastly, there is the sync charge function. And what this lets you do is you would need to build a Y harness that plugs into both of these output ports and connect that Y harness to a single battery. And what that'll let you do is use both channels, 300 watts, at the same time to charge a single battery at up to 600 watts and presumably to 30 amps. We already did a whole bunch of math to show that most people doing FPV won't have batteries that require that high of an output, but if you felt like you wanted to do that, then the charger does support it. The last function to mention here is the power supply function, which lets the charger act like a bench power supply. In other words, it can output a controlled current and voltage. So you can say we're going to output 24 volts at a maximum of 300 watts. Well, that's kind of a lot. A lot of times what you would do is you would set this to like, let's say you have a quadcopter you want to power up on the bench. So you would set it to 16 volts and you would say maximum output power of, and you would set that real low. So like you couldn't spin your motors, or if you short circuit something, it won't be damaged. Oh, it looks like 25 watts is the minimum. So it doesn't have the same granularity as something like a true bench supply, where you can really limit the current to, 1 amp or something. But it does give you very basic functionality for a DC power supply, and some people might find that useful. Here on the side of the unit is a USB plug that's used for firmware updates. Firmware updates are pretty easy on Hobbymate chargers. You download the Updater app to your computer, you plug in USB, and you run the Updater app, and that's pretty much all there is to it. This is a servo plug. The charger has some servo test functions. I don't think that's going to be a lot of use to a lot of people in FPV who typically don't work with servos, but cool. And you're probably going to have a dedicated servo tester anyway, but hey, nice to have it, I guess. And then here on the back are two USB ports for USB charging. This one outputs 2.1 amps, and this one outputs, this is a PD, power delivery, which it's supposed to be rated for up to 45 watts. So like you could theoretically charge some laptops off of this USB-C port. That's pretty slick. Now, we haven't talked very much about the power supply, and that's because in some sense there's not that much to say about a power supply. It just outputs power. I have done some extended charging tests on this guy just to hit it at its limit and see if it's going to like blow up or anything, and it didn't, but I haven't had it for, you know, hours and hours and hours and days and days and days either. In general, Hobbymate has a pretty good track record of making stuff that does what it says and doesn't blow up. However, it has to be mentioned that it has a freaking fan, and the fan is small and somewhat loud. I don't know how much it's picking that up, and it runs all the time. Not just when you're charging, it just runs all the time. So that wasn't my favorite thing. Now, to be fair, all chargers have fans and all chargers make noise when they are charging, and I'm not sure. I feel like this one is a little louder. The D6 Dual Lite is a little louder than the D6 Dual, just because the D6 Dual is bigger and therefore it has a much larger fan on it, and larger fans are quieter. I feel like I would be doing you a disservice if I didn't at least mention these things are kind of freaking loud. It's got feet on the bottom, so you can tilt it towards yourself if you'd like. It's kind of nice. The power supply also has feet on the bottom. I'm guessing they just use the same base. There's no reason to tilt the power supply that I can think of. So that brings us to the end of the video. And as always, the question, should you buy it? And I think one simple way to answer that question is to compare the D6 Dual Lite directly against the D6 Dual Pro. The D6 Dual Pro costs $150 for the version that has the built-in AC power supply. That's what you're looking at here. And that is exactly the same price as the Hobbymate D6 Dual Lite with power supply. They both cost $150. Specs-wise, they are pretty close. The D6 Dual Pro does 650 watts divided between two channels, and it does 200 watts off its AC power supply. The D6 Dual Lite does 600 watts and 240 watts off its power supply. Pretty close. The main difference between them is going to be, well, number one, the D6 Dual Lite can be separated from its power supply and taken along somewhere if you're going somewhere where you could charge it like off a car battery, whereas this one, you're always going to be bringing the power supply with you. However, the D6 Dual Pro is it's quieter. I would much rather have this guy sitting on the bench. The freaking fan turns off when it's not running. That's nice. If you intend to use these with a power supply that you've already got, the situation changes slightly. This guy is $80. The Dual Lite is $80 all by itself. There is a DC only version of the D6 Dual Pro that costs $110. Now, the D6 Dual Pro does have a few things going for it. It's got NFC touchless charging for your phone, and I don't know. I'm not sure many other. I mean, it's a little bigger, a little easier to use, just stay in one place. I don't know. It's a weak argument. I think if you're looking at the DC only version, there is a compelling case to be made for the D6 Dual Lite, especially because it has some charging programs that the Dual Pro doesn't have. But if you are looking at an AC/DC version, I personally would lean more towards the D6 Dual Pro. And just, I don't know. I just guess it depends a lot on how much you travel. This thing is significantly heavier. 582 grams versus 282, so 300 grams heavier. So those times when you take it out to the field with you to charge off your car battery, you're carrying 300 extra grams. That's not nothing. Another charger that's gotta be considered is the ToolkitRC M6D, which has similar output power to the Hobbymate and is only $60 compared to $80. Personally, I think the additional money for the Hobbymate is worth it, if only for the additional capabilities of the Hobbymate, the additional programming modes like regenerative discharge and so forth. I would pay 20 extra bucks for that. In addition, my experience has been that Hobbymate chargers have been pretty rock solid across the board, whereas ToolkitRC, they're kind of like the Star Trek movies. Like one of them is really solid and then one of them is kind of not as good. And then one of them is really solid. Kids, I mean the old Star Trek movies, not the new ones, not the J.J. Abrams ones. They just went downhill, right? Number 1 was pretty good. Number 2 was like, yeah. Number 3 was like, what are you even doing? I feel like we've gotten off track. Anyway, if you feel like the Hobbymate D6 Dual Lite is the charger for you, or if you are curious about this guy here that I've been talking so much about, I've got links in the video description to both of these products, and I also have links to the review that I did of the Hobbymate D6 Dual Pro. You can check that out and see if it's very similar to this review, just with some different numbers, and there's not actually a lot of point in going to watch it, frankly. You kind of know what you need to know. There's links in the video description. They are affiliate links, and that means if you click that link and then you make any purchase after clicking that link, I get a small commission. It's an easy way for you to support the channel. It doesn't cost you anything. Just click the link, fill up your cart, check out, give me a commission. I sure do appreciate it. That's going to do it for this video. Happy flying. What are you doing in here? The least you could do is subscribe or join my Patreon, or like just here's another video I picked out for you. Jeez.